You're listening to Women's Media Center Live with Robin Morgan.
Welcome to Women's Media Center Live. I'm Robin Morgan. And today, in our new Fables for Grown-Ups series, we have a two-parter. In fact, it's back by popular demand, the story called The Handmaiden of the Holy Man. This story is in Parallax, my book published by Spinifex Press. And I must say I've never quite experienced a story like it. I say experienced because, in fact, it actually came to me in a dream. One always hears of that sort of thing happening to writers, but is rarely a lucky enough writer oneself to, experience it. It's a long short story, and so part 1 will be our fable for this week and part 2 for next. And I'll be back with part 1 in just a moment, after this message and our first break. Subscribe to this program on your favorite podcast platform and leave us a review. Follow us on Twitter at WMC Live, like our Facebook page at facebook.com/WMC Live, and visit us at WMCLive.com for more information about our show and our guests.
You're listening to Women's Media Center Live with Robin Morgan.
Now for part 1 of our Fables for Grown-Ups this week, the story, The Handmaiden of the Holy Man, part 1. Once there was a man thought to be holy. He sat near the top of a mountain. He sat there night and day, and it seemed that he never moved. Some said he was always praying, or that he meditated, or that he saw visions. Some said that this must make him holy, or at least wise. No one could quite recall when he had first come to sit on his ledge in the mountain, but almost everyone could remember that at one time, years earlier, pilgrims had made their way up to him, not without difficulty, to put before him their disputes, their spiritual questions, their despair, their own attempts at holiness. His judgments were so severe, however, and were delivered in tones so sternly contemptuous of the seekers, that the same visitors rarely returned. And in time, as word spread, fewer and fewer pilgrims wound their way up the narrow mountain path. At last only 1 or 2 a year would approach the holy man, and then, as if he were an oddity, a curious sight to be stared at, not a living saint to be questioned or followed or hearkened to or imitated, or perhaps even wholly trusted. Finally, almost no one came at all. He sat still, nonetheless, on his ledge, seeming to gaze out over the near and distant peaks of other mountains, his eyes blinking now and then against the wind, his flesh wasting away toward desiccation, his body a bony triangle of spine balanced on a base of crossed legs, a gaunt skull at the apex. He never seemed to speak, though his lips could be seen moving. No one could possibly estimate his age. All this time, you understand, the woman known as the Handmaiden of the Holy Man remained faithful. It was the handmaiden of the holy man who built the rickety lean-to that sheltered the holy man's body from the rainy season. It was she who had guided visitors up the strenuous path in the old days, and she who still could be seen sometimes scouring the valley villages as if to recruit new pilgrims. It was she, of course, who begged for his food, and carried it up to him each evening in the wooden bowl that was known throughout all the villages as the Holy Man's Bowl, this despite the fact that no one could remember ever having seen the Holy Man carry it. But then no one could recall ever having known the woman's name either, although she was familiar to everyone in the area. Indeed, she might never have had a name of her own. She had become, in any event, simply the handmaiden of the holy man. And although 2 or 3 villagers might whisper in dispute as to whether the mountain's recluse was holy at all, and although 1 or 2 villagers might even wonder at the definition of the begging bowl as the holy man's begging bowl when he had never been seen carrying it, no one seemed to question the title of the woman, known as the handmaiden of the holy man. Perhaps this was because she had announced herself as such so fiercely and for so long that no one cared to argue the point, though no one could actually recall when or if she had begun giving this impression. Or perhaps this was because no one else was eager to compete for her, for either her title or her task. And while ignoring a holy man's teachings wasn't that uncommon, letting one starve to death would have brought shame on all the surrounding villages. Perhaps, too, the title Handmaiden of the Holy Man was simply an accurate description of what appeared to be her life. What else, after all, was she? Year after year, the handmaiden of the holy man was assailed by questions. In the early days, the questions had come from outside herself. But as the pilgrims stopped approaching, and later, as even the reliable donors to the bowl she bore stopped inquiring about him, the questions began from within herself. It was not, after all, as though she had a right to be surprised. She had made it clear from the beginning that he was fit only to be a holy man. He had made it clear that he must sit, withdrawn from all material, fleeting, menial concerns, purely himself, focused on his thoughts, on a mountaintop. If the world came and asked anything of him, as had pilgrims seeking counsel, or if the world came and offered anything to him, as had contributors to a beggar's bowl, that was the business of the world, not his concern. Neither compassion nor gratitude must distract him. Even though he had never spoken this aloud in words, the empty spaces socketed behind his eyes had told her so. The handmaiden of the holy man could not say that he had ever deceived her. Yet year after year she was assailed by questions. She remembered that in the early days the questions pilgrims asked her had seemed at first impossibly difficult to answer. They asked, "What is the holy man really like?" They asked, "Can he work miracles?" 1 or 2 even asked, "What's it like to be the handmaiden of the holy man?" She recalled with a wistful smile how her replies had changed over the years. In the beginning she had maintained an enigmatic silence while wearing an expression that intimated she knew far more than she would ever tell. Later, hard-pressed and feeling sympathy for the questioners, she had begun to invent answers. Sometimes the answers would vary from pilgrim to pilgrim, which the villagers interpreted as further weighty mysteries of contradiction. Thus she added to the legend of the holy man, when actually she was merely experimenting with various responses to see which was most effective in hiding her own ignorance. This solution had lasted until pilgrims began to ask different questions. Why is he so severe in his counsel to us? Why does no mercy temper his judgments? Do we interrupt his meditations or his mission? Only then did the handmaiden of the holy man begin to reply simply, "I don't know." At first this response felt to her like a shameful admission of her own ignorance. In time it felt to her like a betrayal of the holy man. At last she grew indifferent to its being anything but the truth. Now she told herself that eventually the questions that assailed her from within would grow as irrelevant as those from without had become, even though these new questions seemed far more difficult to respond to than any of the world's curiosity. How did I come to be here? The handmaiden of the holy man asked herself. Did I choose this freely? Have I spent my life serving him to no purpose? Or am I using him as an instrument of my freedom, while believing myself an instrument of his? Did he ever really need me to serve him? These and many other questions the handmaiden of the holy man asked herself, and she found that she could invent answers to all of them, as she had done at one time with the questions of the pilgrims. As before, she found that she often had different answers to the same question, and that these answers gave rise to still more questions. She was dazed by these questions. They preyed on her constantly. Even asleep in a nest that she had built for herself, one ledge down from the holy man's lean-to, she dreamed more questions. By day, treading her rounds in the villages, she moved as if groping her way forward inside a private swarm of questions, so much so that she began to forget to recruit pilgrims. Some villagers assumed she was in a mystical state of transcendence, contracted from having lived for so many years in close proximity to a holy man. Others thought she had gone deaf or lost her wits. Yet they had no reason to fear her, even in this new state, so they averted their gaze from the absence in her eyes, contributed to the holy man's bowl she carried still, and let be. She was waiting for the third stage, the one where she would simply be able to say, "I don't know," to all the questions and be free of them. It had happened before. Why shouldn't it happen again? Another year passed, and another. Still the handmaiden plodded her rounds, waiting. But now her questions grew to obsess her, for she was weary of invented answers, unable to find real ones, and still incapable of embracing her own ignorance. One day, more exhausted than her completed rounds would warrant, she bore the bowl, how it seemed to get heavier each year, up the winding path to where the holy man sat on his ledge, strands of his long hair lifting in the wind, his lips moving slowly. She had been in 5 villages that day, and had walked for miles, yet no more than usual. Vaguely she recalled something, what was it, through the babble of questions in her mind. Is he a holy man? Who am I to question? How can I cease to question and be at peace? She recalled that the villagers had seemed especially kind and patient with her that day, and the thought occurred to her that given their generosity and the heaviness of the bowl, the holy man would have a special feast tonight. Not that he cared for such matters, as he was above lowly things. The handmaiden of the holy man knelt to set the bowl at the holy man's feet. It was then she saw, to her shock, that the bowl was empty. At the same moment she knew this was not because the good villagers had refused to fill it. All at once her questions parted like a veil, and she glimpsed the reason the bowl was empty, as filled with terror at this apparition, and as awed as one who spies the naked face of a god. The handmaiden of the holy man had that day forgotten to beg. She rose from her kneeling position. She faced the holy man, who stared not at her but at the distant mountain peaks. She stood while the wind whirled around them both. She began to ask him her questions. As if in a dream, yet more awake than she had ever felt herself before, she heard her voice quietly pose question after question, pulling each one out of herself, trailing anguish, and laying it like an offering at his feet. The lips of the holy man ceased moving. It seemed to her as if the two of them had been poised that way for eternity, winds whipping around them, her questions falling one by one like fire flowers into the abyss of his silence, her eyes fixed on him, his eyes fixed on the distance. Then she had no more questions. Yet still she waited. It seemed to the handmaiden of the holy man that she had lived and died 1,000,000 lives while waiting for his answer to reach her through his silence. But no answer came. She bent again and gently pushed the begging bowl she had borne, but which everyone seemed to know was his, closer to him, in a tender gesture that seemed to say he would have need of it now. She noticed one drop of water making a glistening rivulet down the sloped wooden side of the bowl, to lie like an eye or a diamond at its center. Then she realized, astonished, that it was a tear, and that she was weeping. She stood again and peered off into the distance toward which he stared. Her whole being followed her gaze as she strained to glimpse what he saw. But there were only the far-off mists ringing the snowy peaks. The handmaiden of the holy man turned once more to look at him, and through her tears she smiled a forgiveness more infinite than she had known she possessed. Then she turned and walked slowly down the winding mountain path. The villagers were surprised to see the handmaiden of the holy man descend the mountain path in the evening, accustomed as they were to her visits earlier in the day. They watched as she moved through the villages, and a few wondered if the glint of moisture on her face could possibly be tears. But they decided it must be the evening mist, for she had never been seen to weep. She walked faster and faster, and her face seemed almost a blur in the blue light of dusk. Each village she passed through assumed she was journeying to some destination in the next, and it was a few days before everyone in the surrounding countryside came to understand that she had stopped nowhere. The handmaiden of the holy man had disappeared. Everyone's first concern was for the holy man, of course. Since he had not come down to beg with his bowl, he must be starving up on the mountain ledge. A delegation of villagers was hurriedly assembled from candidates whose self-righteousness was fortunately greater than their reluctance. They labored up the steep path, burdened by baskets of food, and a sense of outrage that the handmaiden of the holy man should have deserted her post, necessitating their having to perform this direct act of charity themselves. They told one another that the handmaiden was an ingrate, who had betrayed her master as well as those whose generosity had enabled her for years to bring him a laden bowl. They told one another that she was a fool who had never been able to appreciate the holy man's teachings the way they themselves had. They told one another that she was a doomed soul fallen into wickedness, for obviously she had sought the pleasures of the world in turning from the liberating path of sacrificial service to which they themselves had never aspired. They told one another that she was a madwoman, for who else would brave the world alone after such a sheltered existence? If she somehow managed to escape death, more degrading ends would await her. One or two members of the delegation did wonder what could have driven her away. But so durable was the tradition of veneration for a holy man, even a holy man not visited in years, so durable was the tradition of veneration for the idea of a holy man, that those few who found themselves momentarily curious about the handmaiden's motives quickly suppressed such heretical thoughts. As the delegation of villagers neared the top of the mountain, however, their chattering chilled to a hush. Each one was remembering what little knowledge they all, any of them, actually had of the holy man. Those who had made pilgrimages to him years earlier recalled the severity of his judgments, the distance in his voice, the way he never looked at his supplicant, but fixed his eyes instead on the neighboring mountain peaks. Those who had never been in his presence before remembered all the stories they had heard of pilgrims who returned from the holy man's ledge, filled with self-contempt for their own hopeless ways, their grossness, stupidity, lack of vision. how such returned pilgrims would sit for weeks in front of their huts, staring into space as their teacher had done, until gradually they realized that others still moved about, lived, laughed, made love, shared food around the cook fires. Then they would discover the greater insight that these neighbors were as hopeless, gross, stupid, and impoverished in vision as they themselves, but lacked their enlightenment in having learned that. And so the returned pilgrims experienced the miracle of a contempt for others greater than the ones they had been taught to feel for themselves. And the exporting of this contempt gave them the energy to begin living again, to laugh, make love, share food around the cook fires, and in time forget everything, except that they did not wish to journey up the mountain path again. Eventually, back and leg muscles straining and nerves in a state of ominous excitement, the villagers rounded the final turn of the path to see the ledge before them. Shreds of cloth bindings from the lean-to fluttered in the light morning wind like a lonely, many-armed god beckoning his followers. But there was no holy man. There was no one at all. Only a begging bowl was left, sitting empty on the ledge like a sign, a rune, a signature that a handmaiden had been there, a message that once someone had given and someone had taken. Someone had begged and someone had not. Someone had fed and someone had been nourished. And all that remained was emptiness. For a time, the villagers could talk of little else but the absence of the holy man. After the first delegation returned, carrying their offerings back down with them, other groups wound their way up the mountain path, some to see for themselves, some on the assumption that the holy man would eventually return to his ledge. Indeed, in the weeks following the news of the holy man's vanishing, more pilgrims climbed the mountain in search of him than had ever done when he was there. But always they found only the frayed shelter in its progress toward gradual collapse, the stark rocks, sparse vegetation, and empty begging bowl. Finally, even this last vanished into the cloak folds of someone irked that a perfectly serviceable bowl was going unused. After a while, the villagers reconciled themselves to the certainty that the holy man was no more. Some said he was dead. Some said he had never existed. After all, no one had seen him for years. The only proof they had of his presence was the perpetual, taken-for-granted existence of his handmaiden, at least until she had suddenly left him, or left them. And where they initially blamed her for his disappearance, they came to blame her for his existence, for having invented him in the first place as an excuse to beg for unearned sustenance, because everyone knew that she herself could never have been holy. In this manner the villagers comfortably solved their disturbing mystery, and their lives went on as before. But then strange rumors began to drift among them about the woman they had for so long called the handmaiden of the holy man. These were rumors that she had been seen again, but each time in differing circumstances. A group of village women who had journeyed to bring their handicrafts to the district market said they saw her telling fortunes by the cards and spinning yarns in a stall at the marketplace. The yarner's name, one had learned, was Anka. Another woman, returning from a visit to her mother in a distant village, sent word back to her sister that the handmaiden of the holy man was a well-known figure there, going by the name Mailade, a healer who had founded a haven for the sick, the mad, and the needy, though mostly women and children wound up there. A husband and wife, gone out from the foothills to the plains to trade with an anticipated caravan, had both seen the handmaiden of the holy man, though they quarreled over the details. The husband remembered her riding in a palanquin, adorned in the finest scarlet silk, reclining against cloth of gold cushions. He had inquired of a caravan traveller and learned that the lady was Bretiang, a courtesan renowned for her wit and beauty. His wife, however, insisting loudly that all women looked alike to her husband, said that she had really seen the handmaiden of the holy man, but certainly not as a courtesan. The wife saw her wearing a man's loose trousers and wool cloak, riding at the head of the caravan on a fine stallion with a coat the shade and sheen of midnight satin. She said the handmaiden had been calling orders to a group of followers who addressed her respectfully by the name of Uwan. 2 young men, libertines from a particularly rowdy village, swore that while out hunting they were attacked by a wild woman of the woods who hellishly yowled, "This from me, this from Uxten," with each blow she dealt. She was, they said, easily recognizable as the handmaiden of the holy man. A small child who wandered away from home, following the trail of bright orange field daisies with dark velvet centers that grew along the foothills, returned home safely the next day. When questioned by his frantic parents as to how he had survived, the child answered that the lady who used to beg with the bowl took care of him and set him on the path toward home. The lady's name, as the child pronounced it in a babyish lisp, sounded like Everaze. For years, different folk from surrounding villages claimed sightings of the woman once called the handmaiden of the holy man. Always she appeared in new circumstances and always with a different name. Yet in all this time no one had seen even a shadow of the holy man. Nor had anyone, for longer than the villagers now cared to remember, climbed the mountain to look for him. They were as certain he was dead or had never been there at all, as they were convinced that his handmaiden was alive and everywhere. That was part 1 of the story, The Handmaiden of the Holy Man, our this week's fable for grown-ups. And part 2 will be featured next week, so don't forget to come back for that. And that's our show for this week. You can follow me on social media at The Robin Morgan. You can check out my blog at robinmorgan.net, and you can find my new novel, Parallax, and my just-out new book of poems, Harvesting Darkness, wherever books are sold. Portions of this program were taped earlier. Views expressed here do not necessarily represent the WMC. Here's the family for Women's Media Center live. Executive producer, as well as founding and sustaining sponsor, Regina K. Scully. WMC president and co-executive producer for this program, Julie Burton. I'm Robin Morgan, your producer and host. Thank you for being with us. Join us next time on Women's Media Center Live.